All righty. All right, welcome everyone. Mike, can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some issues with my camera, um, but no big deal. Welcome everyone to this session, Customize and Automate Your Lead Lifecycle in Salesforce. Happy to be here. My name is Nick Lozier from Sercante, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. Yes, the session is being recorded and will be available on demand afterwards. If you do have a question, I'm going to be moderating and keeping track of those questions. So please just throw those in chat. We will address them. And let's go ahead and get started. Mike, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. So I'm Mike Morris. I'm also with Sercante. I'm a senior engagement manager at Sercante. Been there about 6 years. Background is marketing, and it's been really fun to take that marketing background and apply it to Salesforce ecosystem. So today we're going to kind of walk through how we can use Salesforce to customize and automate our lead life cycles, and hope you enjoy it. So before we get started, I do want to say thanks to our sponsors. Without our sponsors, we couldn't have great events like this. So Sercante, Salesforce, Stencil, The Spot, Storylane, we appreciate all of you. And if you have time, check the sponsors out. Please be sure to do that. So today we're going to talk about the importance of lifecycle statuses. We're going to talk about several different options for updating statuses. I'm going to do a demo of an option that I use using Flow. We're also going to talk about closing the feedback loop between sales and marketing. To me, this is one of the most important things, and it's really often overlooked. Marketers will always, send a lead over to sales, but never hear back what actually happened with that lead. So closing that feedback loop to me is really critical. And then lastly, we're going to have a quick summary and hopefully we'll have some Q&A. Without that, with further ado, we'll get moving. So lifecycle statuses. So why are they important? So just for a moment here, put yourself in the shoes of a BDR or an SDR, and say you get these two leads. You see the lead on the left here, there's no account engagement grade, but a score of 162. You see the lead on the right, you have a B plus, score of 72. Well, what does that mean?
We are having people say.
Sorry, Nick.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We're having people say that they cannot hear us, so I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Oh, and now they can hear us. So I'm sorry, Mike. We had a bunch of people saying
Actually
it.
can hear us.
Yeah, apologize for the interruption. Go ahead.
All right. Sorry, everyone. All right, perfect. So getting back to the slide here. So the situation here is, you're an SDR or a BDR. You have this lead pop in Salesforce. You look at this, you could really easily make the assumption that the lead on the left is the better lead based on the score alone. Without knowing the context of what that grade and score mean, it's hard for someone who's not in this day-to-day like we are to actually understand what this means. So this is where lifecycle statuses come into play. The sales team really needs context. So when you think about that data coming into Salesforce, regardless of where it's coming from, the marketing team, the marketing ops team, whoever is generating that lead has the context. And really, it's their responsibility, in my eyes, to provide that to sales teams. And this can be done by translating those things, those letters, those numbers, those codes that we're getting into statuses, or you don't even need to call it lifecycle status. You call it whatever you want, a lead rating, whatever you want to call this, so your sales teams really understand what you're talking about. And when you're doing this, there are some best practices to follow. We want to talk about working with the sales teams to develop these contexts. So we want to work in collaboration with the sales leadership. We don't want marketing or another group in a vacuum to design these statuses and just push them down to sales. It needs to be a collaborative process. SLAs are also really critical. So if we're sending this lead over to the sales team, we need to set an expectation of how quickly it can be followed up on based on the actual priority of that lead, and make sure that this is agreed to by both parties. And very similar to as we do with scoring inside account engagement right now, lifecycle statuses should be reviewed regularly and updated based on feedback from the sales teams. If we say a hot lead is a score of over 100 and we send it over to sales, we need sales to tell us, hey, Mike, that really wasn't that hot. So I know to go back in the future to adjust my score. Maybe my hot is now 125 or 150. So that's really important that we have that back and forth. Otherwise, we're going to really lead to a sales team that's going to not take those marketing leads with much credence, and they're going to, just kind of ignore them. One of the ways I like doing this is by I call it the lifecycle matrix here, but you can call it whatever you'd like here. It's Rosetta Stone is another term I was toying with. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm defining my lifecycle statuses based on my account engagement grades and scores. So what I'm doing here, as you can see in the left column, is I'm giving the A grade a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a prioritization. So if you've met my grade criteria, you're my perfect ICP, I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway and say, even if your score is a little bit less than 100, between 75 and 99, you're still a hot MQL. But if you're any other grade, you're going to have to score up higher to hit a high MQL status. So I'm giving a little bit more of a bump to that grade because that person's meeting both criteria points. So hopefully that all makes sense so far. I think it's pretty cool. I really like how this works out. So now once you have that figured out, you have a couple options for updating this information inside Salesforce. The first option is probably the most simple and what most people who are using account engagement would default to. I've done this myself many times, so I'm not passing any judgment there. But it's a simple solution, just using an Engagement Studio program. And you can use a complex rule logic and essentially say, if a person meets this criteria, grade score combo, change our lifecycle status. Syncs over to Salesforce, you're good to go. The only issues with this process are account engagement studio programs only run once per day. So think of a situation where, Nick might come to your website, at 10 this morning, he completes a form on the site. His score goes up, triggers the engagement studio program, his status is updated. Later in the day, he comes back and says, man, that document was great. I want to talk to their sales team now. Completes the contact us form. Well, that second entry, that second submission, the grade's going to get updated. It's going to, be inside account engagement, but that engagement studio program is not going to run till tomorrow. So you're not going to see that bump inside Salesforce till the next day. So that's a key consideration because it could really impact your speed to lead process. The other issue is complex rule logic. You can go usually 5 layers deep on complex rule logic. In a lot of cases, that's going to work fine for you. But if you refer back to that little matrix I showed on the previous slide, that gets kind of technical when you start looking at the criteria, and you can't accommodate for all that inside those 5 rules. Next way you could do this is you could get around that by using dynamic lists, but that introduces a whole nother level of issues because dynamic lists do have to refresh. So if you're relying on dynamic lists as a decision point inside an Engagement Studio program, there's a high likelihood that prospect could pass that point prior to the dynamic list being refreshed if it's not done properly. So there's some other issues that kind of come with the Engagement Studio program approach, which is why I prefer the flow approach. So the thing that's great about flow is actions are triggered on a field value change. There are no limitations on run frequency. So if Nick filled out that form at 10 o'clock, filled out another form at 10:05, another one at 10:15, that flow is going to fire 3 times. We can do mathematical calculations if we need to. Formula fields are another key area that really help with this. We can also customize user notifications. We've all seen notifications from account engagement before, and if you know what you're looking for, they're great, but sometimes sales teams are kind of confused by them. So Flow, you can really customize that. You can also update information on related objects and inject data in custom objects as well. So it gives you a lot more flexibility on the Flow side. Now, there are some considerations we need to consider as well. So in order for the flow to run, obviously the prospect has to be inside account engagement. So when you're, inside Salesforce. So when you're creating that record inside account engagement, you do have to have an assignment process. so those records sync over. The way I like doing this is if I'm not assigning to a specific person, based on a lead being super qualified, I generally just assign to it like a marketing queue or an MQL queue, just so I can get it into Salesforce. And that way I can still trigger the assignment, trigger the flows. Flows are also object specific. So for those working inside account engagement exclusively, this is a key consideration. We're used to, prospects inside account engagement, and Engagement Studio program impacts both. Inside Salesforce, flows are object specific. So if we build a flow on the lead object, it's only going to update records on the lead object. If we want to also look at contacts, we have to have a flow running on the contact object as well. So that's really, really important here. And the last thing to keep in mind is that account engagement scores can only be updated inside account engagement. It's kind of deceiving because if you create a flow, you can actually change the score of the account engagement. You can actually change the score inside a flow. However, when the records sync, it's going to revert back to the account engagement score. So that's really important because if you want to change those scores, you have to go back to account engagement. So with that said, now let's take a look at this flow. We're going to kind of walk through some design elements of the flow first, and then I'm going to actually show the flow inside my org, and we'll do some testing, some debugging, and kind of play around with it a little bit. Nick, keep me honest on time here. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use a record triggered flow in this case. We're going to use this flow, and we're going to basically trigger any time a new record's created, the par score changes, or the par grade changes. So again, this is giving me that flexibility that we mentioned earlier, where if a person interacts or engages with you multiple times in the same day, we are going to trigger the flow multiple times in the same day. The next area is the decision element. This is kind of where the magic comes in on this flow. This is where we're going to really choose the paths that people go down. And this is kind of where I was talking about with the complex rule logic, we run into issues. As you can see here, this path I have it's highlighted right now for inquiry, is pretty deep. We're looking at scores, we're looking at grades, we're looking at different criteria. And if you tried baking all that into just those complex rule logic, it simply wouldn't work. You wouldn't have the flexibility you need. And we'll look at this in a bit more detail in the actual flow. And then resource flow also has formulas, which are really cool. So in this case, we can use formulas to set values like dates, example here. But what I'm doing here is I'm not just saying, set this first MQL date regardless. I'm basically saying if the date is already blank, then set the date. If I was using account engagement, it would get a little bit more complicated in terms of doing that. I'd have to have multiple nodes to make it a little bit more challenging. Could accomplish it, but this is a much cleaner interface. And this is kind of what the whole beast looks like when we get it all built out here. It's not too bad, but we'll take a look at it in more detail here because this will let you see exactly what it's doing. So this is the flow itself. If you're not familiar with flow here, this is your toolbox on the left here, kind of shows you the elements that you're working with, the resources, and some of our formula fields we're dealing with as well. At the top here, this is our entry criteria. And again, we're using a formula here. You could use regular logic, but I just prefer the formula. It gives me a little bit more flexibility. And then this is really kind of the magic element here. This is where we're controlling all the criteria within our little matrix. The thing that's nice here is we can add additional paths as needed by clicking the plus button. So if we had a fifth path we need to add, we could just add another one. And the real magic is this conditional logic. It's very similar to a Salesforce report where you can say if 1 and 2 or 3 or 4 and define your criteria to make it really work for you. The elements below here, the pink elements, these are where we're actually updating our records. So in this element here, we're basically setting our first MQL date. We're setting this record to hot, and we're also incrementing an MQL counter. The MQL counter is kind of interesting too. This is another formula field here where we can go in here, and what we're doing is basically saying, if the counter is blank, set to 1. If it already has a value, add 1 to it. So this way we can track how many times a prospect or a lead has gone through our processes over and over. So let's
Hey,
take a look
Mike.
at how, yes.
I wanted to interrupt you before you got out of this section. We did have a question come through, and I assume that this is in the entry criteria, but the question was, what should happen when the lead score threshold is reached? Does the score stay, especially if the lead object is not in use? So I'm not sure exactly what they meant by the second part of that question, but.
Well, the first part, I'm gonna actually, it's a really good question. I'm gonna show you right now. So let's look at this. You're kind of reading ahead in my slides there, whoever asked that question, so I appreciate it. So we're gonna debug right here. I want to back out of this for a second. It thinks I saved something. It thinks I changed something, so it's wanting me to save again. Let's just go in that flow again real quick. I didn't change anything, but we'll go into it anyway. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna do a quick debug so you can kind of see how the process works. In this case here, I'm gonna debug based on an individual who has a high score already. So this individual here already has a grade of A, already has a score of 76. So by default on our matrix, that record is already a hot MQL. Let's say this individual then does something else and interacts and their score goes to 105, just pick a number. What's going to happen in this case here is they're going to follow this path here. But what I want to do here is, because this person was already a hot MQL, I don't want to increment them again. They can't become hotter, for example. So what I'm doing is I'm using an additional node here, and I'm saying, if that previous record's value was already a hot MQL, don't even bother making any updates. Just leave them as is. So that kind of addresses that question you were saying about, do you keep processing the same record over and over? Now let's look at another record here. Hopefully it's not going to ask me to save again. Good. A different person here. Now this individual here has a score of 63 and a B. So by default, this person's an inquiry. So now let's say they do something on your website, they complete a website form, they jump up to 100 points. I'm going to do 101 just to make sure. Go jump up to 100 points. At this point, they're going to go back through the process again. It's going to identify them as qualifying as a hot MQL. Because they weren't previously a hot MQL, we're going to upset their status to hot MQL, and we're going to also increment their MQL counter. So it's a nice way of just kind of making sure this is happening in real time, getting sales information they need, and really translating those codes and those things that we deal with on a regular basis to terms that are understandable and relatable, so they know the quality of the lead and they know what they should be following up with. Any questions related to that before I jump to the next section about how we can look at closing the feedback loop?
Yep, I don't see anything right now, Mike.
Awesome, thank you.
And you're doing great on time. We have about 12 minutes.
Thanks. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about, so now we're effectively have a process in place for elevating the lifecycle status of records of leads. Well, what happens when sales gets that lead and they say, Mike, this really wasn't that good. How's that feedback loop going to come back to us? So, this is my quote here. These are hot leads and need to be called immediately. And I attribute this to every marketer, including myself. In the real world, we know not every lead's going to purchase. We know that some are going to need to be nurtured, and we know that sales has ability to provide feedback to us. So we're going to allow this by using lifecycle statuses or lead statuses. So inside Salesforce, in most page layouts, you're going to have the paths across the top of the screen where the sales teams are working, and they can move that lead from open to nurture to unqualified. So what we can do is we can use changes in these statuses to trigger flows that allow us to decrease our scores and also change our lifecycle statuses. Now, the key point to remember here is we did talk earlier about account engagement scores can only be modified inside account engagement. So you got to kind of keep that in mind here because that's part of the process. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to use a flow and an automation rule inside Account Engagement Studio to make this work. We're going to create a custom checkbox inside Salesforce. And once a lead is moved to a nurture status or to a disqualified status, we're going to check that checkbox. That checkbox, when it syncs over to Salesforce, it syncs over to Account Engagement, is going to trigger an automation rule. The automation rule will then degrade the score and uncheck the box, kind of resetting it for the next record. And the action of that score change inside Account Engagement will trigger our first flow, which will again change our lifecycle status. So in this case, the way I have mine set up is if you change the status to nurture, I want their lifecycle status to go to inquiry. If I change them to unqualified, I want to go to suspect. So what I'm doing here is I basically have a single flow inside Salesforce. It's looking for either of those status changes. And then I have two different nodes here doing the updates. So if the person was set to nurture, I'm going to check this trigger score decay box to true. If they're set to disqualified, I'm going to trigger my zero out to true. And then these are what's going to trigger the records to change inside Account Engagement. Let's take a look at that. So that one is right. Sorry, I'm going back and forth. So this flow is right here. So in this case, you can see the decision element is really just looking at which, if it's nurture, it's going to go down one path. If not, it's going to go down the unqualified path. And let's go inside Account Engagement and just look at one of these records, and we'll play with one. So let me get this individual here. I'm going to kind of simulate this one because I don't have enough time to wait for the rules to sync back and forth between the systems. So we're going to look at this individual here. So right now, this individual has a score of 82, a grade of B. Let's say they went through, one of our reps changed this person to nurture. So at this point, we want to degrade their score. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to edit the score. I'm going to set the score back down to 49 because I know that's my minimum threshold for inquiry. Save the prospect. And then when I sync with the CRM, you're going to see that my lifecycle status is going to change inside Account Engagement as well. So let's find this here. And this is essentially what we're doing with the rules. So we set this person back to an inquiry where they were in MQL previously. And then if we look at them inside of Salesforce, we're going to see the same data points now. So what I did there is I really just simulated the process, but that's what would happen naturally in my org. If someone would have gone from open or any other status and moved to nurture, it would have checked that checkbox. The checkbox would then sync over to Salesforce, which then would have triggered the automation rule to run, which would have taken the exact same actions that I just manually took. So I think this is a nice process to really keep the channels open, keep the process working, and keep the lines of communication between sales and marketing working. It really helps to make sure that sales can report back on what they're seeing and not just go with what marketing is saying on everything. So at that point, I'll kind of open up for some Q&A if we have any. If not, I'll kind of run through a quick summary slide and then give you some time back.
Yeah, I don't have anything new right now, Mike, but I did want to just say, yeah, I really love that process, and those are conversations that you and I both have with a lot of clients. Is how to kind of bridge that gap between what's going on in account engagement and what they're seeing in Salesforce, because we certainly don't want our salespeople playing around in Pardot. So. I do have one comment here. Give me 1 second. So our company does not have nurture as a lead stage. Are there workarounds for this, or is it necessary?
Yeah, the stages are completely customizable. So within Salesforce, your Salesforce admin can configure that path to whatever your organization uses. So nurture is just what I used in my org. You could have it as, working, active, inactive, whatever those stages might be in your system. You can certainly customize this process to work within those confines.
Yep.
All right, so the quick summary here. So at the end of the day, sales needs context to understand what leads should be prioritized. If we're just sending things over to them with codes and numbers, it doesn't really help them very much. Salesforce is a really good way to provide this context using flows. The thing I like about flow too is anything inside Salesforce can be used inside that criteria. So let's say your company uses 6sense, for example. On 6sense on accounts, you have account level data. You could use that account level data to trigger very similar processes. Or if you have other processes or other enhancements inside Salesforce that are updating your lead records or contact records with, say, qualification data from ZoomInfo or other sources, you can use that data to factor into the lifecycle statuses just as I was using scores and grades. You could use scores, grades, and Zoom contact ID or whatever you wanted to do. So you can pull additional factors in, which gives you more flexibility. Engagement Studio, like I said, is a viable option. It works really good if speed to lead isn't an issue and you have simple use cases. But if you start getting beyond that, that's where flow really comes into effect. And then last but not least, feedback from sales is critical. So it shouldn't be ignored. It really is the basis for what we need. Is if the marketing team isn't getting that feedback, they're not going to know where to spend their money. They're not going to know where to focus their efforts. So having that feedback from sales and allowing sales to actually move that person back to a nurture status, which would get them back into your marketing nurture programs, is really just helping move that lead through the funnel eventually. So it all works together. It's very symbiotic, I guess, but it works well.
Mike, do you see a lot of the clients that you work with that don't have this process at all, that are just relying on, kind of like throwing it over the wall at sales and hoping it works out, or do you see a lot of clients that have a good feedback loop?
Feedback loop is usually challenging, and it's something I bring up quite often. And it's funny, the process we just went through here was developed really closely with one of my clients. I mean, we worked on this together for a very long time and built all this together. So it was a very collaborative process. And it just makes such great sense now. And whenever I'm working with clients, I always bring this up and say, this is a really cool process. You should check this out. And I've done full-on implementations of this in some orgs, and in other orgs, we've adapted components of it. And the reality is it might vary based on what you need in your unique situation. But I think there are elements of this that can be used inside every organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Really quickly, we have a minute and a half. So this is going to be a tough one, but we did get a question. Do you have any advice or ideal amount of life cycle stages? So what's that sub-stage you use between MQL and SQL? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And really, I think that varies quite a bit too. You can look out there and there's all kinds of different models. Some will have, let's go back to that little matrix again, because it kind of leads into that. Oh, come on, I'm going too slow. So in this case, I'm just going 4 deep. So I'm going a suspect, which is, this looks like somebody I might want to talk to. Inquiry is someone who's shown an interest in me. So they've filled out a form on my website. They've stopped by my booth at a trade show. They've taken some action. An MQL is a little bit more engaged, and a hot MQL was the highest level. I've seen some organizations take the hot MQL and MQL and merge them into one. I've seen some organizations not use a hot MQL, but basically say it's a hand raiser. So this person filled out a contact us form on their website. They've asked to talk to sales. So that's prioritized different than a marketing lead. I've seen others who will use the traditional MQL, and then once an MQL is created, then sales takes it to an SQL. So it really just depends on the process you need. And again, this is a great area to experiment. It's relatively easy to tweak. So you can definitely do that. I've got 5 seconds and I think we've made it.
I was just going to say, you better wrap it up. I want to
Awesome.
thank everyone for joining. Mike, thanks so much. That was a great session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.